Someone like you came to a meeting.
Good evening. 6:00. So, where we go. Last week, Pam and I decided we'd have this nice, quiet little chat and have a cup of tea together down at the local shops. And in walked a guy that she was in the nurses' hostel with, and that ended our quiet chat. But it did supply us with a speaker tonight. So every cloud has a silver lining. And I thought it's been really interesting sort of looking at water from a number of perspectives. And one of the perspectives that we've looked at is from Alistair Humphrey, from the Medical Officer of Health, who gave us a perspective that we could tell he didn't completely agree with himself. And then we had Helen Beaumont last week, who had, the council had effectively had the rug pulled from underneath them by Ministry of Health people in Wellington. Is anyone here from the Ministry of Health? I just really like to question their parentage. But anyway, and then when Ben started talking about bugs in our gut, it's not a topic that the only thing about my gut is I get increasingly concerned that it seems to be poking out further every day. But when Ben started talking in a language I understood, accountants aren't all that good on science, when he started talking in a language that I understood about the gut, our gut and the bugs in it, and what we've done with antibiotics, etc., I thought here's a perspective that the council would probably be really keen to hear, and it's really interesting to see there's no elected representatives here, so either they didn't read their Tuesday Club notes or they don't want to hear. I'd like you to welcome Ben Harris, who's standing up the back.
You couldn't just flick the light on there, could you, Gary, so we can see the speaker?
Oh, for God's sake, that requires an element of skill. Mr. Williams. Yes. For those of us that grew up driving Austin 7s, lights are an optional extra. So I'd like you to welcome Ben Harris.
Thank you very much, Gary. One of the last times I've met I'd met Gary was at a school, and
Use the microphone.
can you hear me without the microphone?
They're all bloody dead.
You can, go on there. And I was at a school, and some choir, overseas choir, Vienna Boys choir, no, it was a Welsh choir I think was singing, and Gary just happened to be in front of me as one of the esteemed guests, and then the school choir sang, and I leant forward and whispered in his ear, "You Dorms couldn't do that." The Dunga got up and to give his opening address and re-quoted what I just said. And the head master looked at me with utter horror on his face that anyone could be so crass. So at short notice I know very little about chlorination really, and bugs and microbiology, and so, but it riles me completely. I think it's a, if I had to put a topic name on tonight, it'd be reasoned thinking. And so one would wonder why, in 2016 I think it was, in Havelock North, why would we not want to chlorinate our water if a town of 40,000 people gets 5,500 illnesses 40-something hospitalizations and 3 or so probable deaths, why would we not want to chlorinate when 98% of the rest of the world does? And you'd need a pretty good reason not to. And we've got it in bucket loads here in Christchurch, absolute bucket loads. Because obviously after that, as there should have been, there's a knee-jerk reaction. What went wrong? How do we eliminate risk? What went wrong? How do we eliminate risk? And what went wrong, because in any reticulation system for water, and we want to have safe water, there's no question of that. We want to feel comfortable with it. How safe is safe? How safe is safe? Is 1 in a million unsafe? 1 in 10 million? 1 in 500,000? How safe is safe? We have to think through risk. And we're not very good at understanding risk collectively as humans. We're emotionally driven. We're not at all good at risk. And I have a favourite expression: God created lotto to punish those that do not understand statistics. We just cannot visualize. We see the advertising of the dream, but we don't really realize we're just throwing it to the wind. It's gone. It's going to charity or something else. That's how we try and justify it. So why would we not want to chlorinate water when 98% of the industrialized world does? And we have to look back. The inquiry that came afterwards showed that the aquifer almost definitely was the primary source, and Havelock North was the primary source. That was number one, really important. The aquifer was the primary source. The wellheads, which we're busily fixing here, the wellheads were almost definitely not any contribution at all. And that there were thousands of sheep on top of the aquifers, or tens of thousands of sheep on top of the aquifers, and when it rained, there was pooling of water, and each gram of feces, poo, shit, call it what you like, in any feces has something like 10 to the 12 billions of bacteria in it. Billions. So where there's pooled water and loads of feces from sheep, there's just an unbelievable number of bugs. When that pooled water is on top of a shallow aquifer, it just goes through like water goes through a sieve. It goes straight through to the aquifer. And so it contaminates the aquifer. But luckily there's systems to keep an eye on that sort of thing. And so we do routine water testing of the water that comes out of the aquifer, goes to the pumping station, where we look for what's called an indicator bug, E. coli. E. coli comes from our gut, comes from our poo. E. coli from humans is relatively non-pathogenic, relatively compared to a lot of other bugs. And I know it can cause urinary tract infections and such like, but we have vast amounts of E. coli in our gut normally, all right? And so it can cause trouble, but it's the easiest one of our gut flora to grow. So it's quite easy to grow it, so we look for it, and when it's there, we know where there's smoke, there's fire. So we tend to look for E. coli mainly when we do the water testing. In Havelock North, they'd done ongoing water testing, and they had ongoing E. coli. For years, carried on going. And somehow it was convenient for whatever the way to ignore it. Let's hope it goes away, or system dysfunction, or financial pressure, or something else. In other words, that oversight was hopeless. So hopeless that prior to this outbreak in 1998, there'd been another outbreak there. As there would be, because all the sheep are on top of the same aquifer and across all the plains, Heritonga Plains I think it is. And so they were already there, and they had already had the huge red flag from all the sheep on top, draining through to this. There's only new water in that aquifer because it is so shallow. Only new water. So it goes through, then it gets pumped and distributed. You check the water, you keep seeing these E. coli, it's a bit inconvenient. And you keep going. So not so many years later, you get another outbreak, which was the 2016 one. And there was dysfunction between the councils, and the dysfunction between the regional council and the city council. There's dysfunction, and we could say we have and or have had partially that here too, so we have to be very careful of systems and that it doesn't actually stop the process being right. So how does that compare to Canterbury? You can understand why 98% of the industrialised world, and coming back a stage further, the 20th century, the beginning and or a bit before. Does anyone know John Snow? John Snow? Cholera, London, Broad Street. Anyone know the story? I don't think I've got time to go into it, but he identified that the cholera outbreak came from a particular well on Broad Street, and he wanted to put chlorine. It's brilliant, really interesting. If you look up Wikipedia or something on John Snow, fascinating person, fascinating. He used anaesthetic for the Queen Victoria for 2 of her children. Was the first person to introduce anaesthetics to the royalty, so it became acceptable in childbirth. He also found the cause of rickets, which was adulterated wheat, because wheat was actually, anyway, I won't get sidetracked. But John Snow used chlorine, or tried to use chlorine, but in the beginning of the 20th century onwards, it's thought that chlorine probably saved a similar number of lives to what car accidents do today, as in the number of deaths. So that's sort of on today's scale. It's been a huge, because so many people worldwide died of gastrointestinal diarrheas and such like. Water quality was a huge, as cities got bigger and bigger, our systems need to get better and better, and so it needed to be chlorinated, and it works. The chlorine works. But we come back to risk. A reasoned person, what would they do? So we look at Christchurch in comparison to Havelock North. So in a system we need really good a source of water, and if it's not, we need, the worse it is, the more disinfection we need to give it. Alright, that's the first thing, the source. Then there's the reticulation system, the pipes and such like, how leaky is it, and what is it like at the tap, and the systems overview are all really critical, the systems overview to keep an eye on. In Christchurch, our aquifers are deep and it is old water, unlike Havelock North. Now these microbes, E. coli and such like, generally only live out of humans or out of animals for a few months, perhaps up to a year. So if you've got new water, they're still alive, the Campylobacter and such like. The other thing I didn't say, it was Campylobacter, I don't think I said. Campylobacter was the identified bug that was found in the north. That's really important, because in keeping with most of the water outbreaks in the world, they tend to be either Campylobacter or one of a couple of parasites, Giardia or Cryptosporidium, 2 parasites. Probably all know those names. The interesting thing is, in health, humans do not carry those bugs at all normally. We can catch them from an animal, but we don't have them, right? Campylobacter, Giardia or Cryptosporidium, we do not have them. So they had Campylobacter, and most of the international outbreaks, and there have been some whoppers, although this one was really big, if not the biggest of it is the biggest, I think, I'm sure, of Campylobacter. Most of them have been one of those 3 bugs. What I'm saying is they are zoonotic. They come from animals. It's really key. Those 3 bugs, the most common in the world, are zoonotic. They come from animals. So we look at our aquifers under Christchurch. Old water and deep. It's really important. Do we have tens of thousands of sheep or cattle all defecating on top of them? No, we don't. So already our source is totally, and is it an isolated aquifer? Is it, can stuff go down to it? No, it has to go down a big depth before it gets there. So that big depth acts like a filter in a large way to filter out microorganisms. And we know it is pure. Then we take it to the pumping station, and this is something else I have trouble with. Relative risk. For decades prior to the earthquake, we'd had no trouble at all. Right? No gastroenteritis outbreaks at all. There were in outside towns out of Christchurch, as we'd expect, because they have different wells, we have Cheviot and all this sort of thing. That's a whole different issue. I'm talking about Christchurch. So for decades we had no trouble at all. Then we had a major risk. 2011, major earthquakes. And then immediately, underground, we have all our water pipes going around, and alongside or somewhere in the vicinity, there's sewer pipes. So if a sewer pipe fractured and a water pipe fractured, the two can get over. That was a major risk time. Everything was immediately chlorinated, but to the best of my knowledge, there was no gastroenteritis cases, and in spite of all the potential risks, it didn't happen. So, which is interesting actually, after such a major earthquake, we've got old underground infrastructure. Then from 2011 through to 2018, when chlorine was put in, our wellheads were in the same condition, but they've been shaken up a bit, but in the same condition as they had been for the decades prior to the earthquake. But we must have been one winter, including floods, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, without, through to 2018, 6 is it, without chlorination, and there was no gastroenteritis outbreaks at all. There's a potential risk, but even with the floods that we had, there was no gastroenteritis. So we know in practice they were safe. Then there was the inquiry which identified the subterranean aquifer as the risk in Napier, the primary risk. They said it's just possible the heads may have been, because if you get a bore head and you get flooding and it goes down, it can contaminate the aquifer. But in all our winters, we've not had any, and nor do we have sheep on top to put the faeces in. We have sewer pipes to take it out. So even if it was pouring down there, it wasn't enough to be detectable. So that's a huge major difference. And then to suddenly turn around and say there's a risk because of the bore heads, we've got to chlorinate everything. I'm just utterly dumbfounded and staggered. I meant to say too at the beginning, if anyone wants to interject, interrupt or question as I talk, please do so. More than happy to, as I go along.
Just one.
Yes.
You said this in Havelock North there's tens of thousands of sheep, and do we have tens of thousands of sheep or cattle on top of our aquifers?
No, we don't. And
By
deep.
confusion, we have 1.3 million cattle on Christchurch.
Not the
Yeah.
supply zone.
Not on that, not underneath our
Isn't the north-
aquifers.
Isn't the north of the city contentious because it is the supply zone?
Yeah. So maybe as we start getting closer, but you can test if it's deep enough. You can test to see. And my point is, there's something like I think 148 wells in Christchurch.
Yeah.
So absolutely no trouble at all if there's an area that happen to have, say, where there is cattle or sheep that's starting to show some E. coli, then you have to chlorinate that area. I have no trouble with that at all. But in practice, to the best of my knowledge, the vast majority of the 148 don't have sheep or cattle on them, and it is not a risk. Yes.
If the sewer and water pipes are broken throughout the city, and I'm fairly aware of it, I had a flatmate who, astonished every night, he came home and said they're not fixing it properly because it's hidden. It might appear, say, in 10 years' time.
Yeah.
Then a bit of chlorine would be helpful at my end
Yeah.
if I don't have a filter.
No, that's good. So I'm going to pick up on that. If we're to chlorinate, and everyone know Edward de Bono?
Yeah.
Yeah. I really, really like the guy. Although I don't know, you never hear of him. I don't know if he's still alive or if he is alive, if he's on the planet.
He's black hair.
Yeah, the 6 thinking hats, and he defined the term lateral thinking as well. But I really like him because much of Western culture, when you're looking at a problem, you look at the positives and you look at the negatives and you weigh them up and you think, actually, that's the way I want to go. He said that, have your positives, have your negatives, but just also go through some other subheadings first. And that can change perception completely. So, what are the consequences? So, yes, there is a risk it could happen in 10 years' time. But I'm going to give and that is a risk. How certain would you want to be if it may happen in 10 years' time, and it was only going to affect that one area, and it would probably start off as a leak, and so I'd be thinking of that as one possibility. But
He
yes,
worked all over Christchurch, and he saw it.
yeah, all over Christchurch. But it's if we have one contaminated well, it's not going to be all over Christchurch.
No, I mean
So-
pipes leaking between in
Yeah.
people's homes throughout the whole of Christchurch.
So how many have been detected so far? What I'm saying is,
They're
as
buried, they're hidden at the moment.
yeah, but the water that comes out is not.
No, I totally
And
agree.
that's tested really regularly.
I got that.
So that's part of the system.
Yeah.
So as they started breaking down more, you would start detecting E. coli in low numbers, and you'd go to source and you'd fix that.
It's not going to show up for 10 years, he said, because of the
No,
way
it won't show up for 10 years. But if, I'll give another one. Say there's 10 years time, because it is a risk, 10 years time, there's a bit of a shake, and all of them start leaking. All the E. coli's will become positive, and we immediately put chlorine in, as we did last time when there's a shake.
Fair enough.
That would be there's always risk, we cannot eliminate it.
Okay.
But that would be my reply on that.
That's good enough.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So, other consequences of, what about the clinical ones? All the people that start getting dermatitis and eczema. And all the people that can't afford to go to their GP to get it dealt with. And what about all the people who lose their hot water cylinders with the copper rots out? And often they do not have the money to do something about it, and or they have to not feed the children, or all the usual parameters. We have to think through those as potential negatives. What about all the people that, if there's chlorine, they only drink water that is non-chlorinated, so they buy bottled water in the plastic bottles, and we have to think of the risks associated with that, and so it goes on. Then you can do toxicity tests on chlorine. It's been done around the world, and it has shown rats and all these other animals large amounts of chlorine, and there seems to be no correlation at all to various cancers, which is really, really comforting. But then the Netherlands did some work in the 1970s which showed that there's a difference between testing the primary compound, as in chlorine, or sodium hypochlorite, and testing what comes out of the tap. Because this leaky pipe that you're talking of, when the chlorine comes along, it reacts with any organic material. So when it's just a little leak and nowhere near enough to cause infections and such like in people, or even be detected, the chlorine activates with it, and there's about 600 different compounds can be produced, and they're now known, there's a lot of work on it, highly likely to be implicated with bladder cancer and many other things. So we have to be a bit, now it's low risk, but it is measurable. So if you don't have to do it, why would you? Most of New Zealand you do have to do it, because they're low aquifers or water from the surface. Most of Banks Peninsula, all the bays and everything there. When it rains, all the feces from all the sheep or cattle come down, go in the creek, and the small houses and such like that's usually there. But we're relatively, unique's not the right word, because unique's one-off, but it is relatively very, very unusual to have a situation like Christchurch, And that's why I have trouble with algorithms. And has anyone, what's that, 20 essays for the 20th century, 21 essays for the 21st century, has anyone read any of those ones? Oh, very, very good. He has a lot of history professor, lots of trouble with algorithms too. Because the person that makes the algorithms starts driving our lives, whether it's on WhatsApp or not WhatsApp or Twitter and all these other things, Google and all the rest. The person that makes the algorithms has considerable control over lives. And so we tend to, MOH and all the others, compartmentalise things. Let's follow the algorithm. And the algorithm is there could be risk, because there was in Hamilton, 98%, so we must put chlorine in. And there's no thinking process goes into that. And I find it totally remarkable. Even the outbreaks worldwide have been, I come back also on your one, which is a good point, because I understand it's a fragile system. The outbreaks worldwide have been primarily, as I said before, Campylobacter, or the parasites Cryptosporidium or Giardia. So even if they started leaking more, it's going to be the E. coli that comes through first, because there's no sheep on top. And even if it was contaminated with human sewage, it takes higher numbers of E. coli than it does Cryptosporidium, Campylobacter or Giardia. So there's a number of, when we think about it, and that takes a bit of microbiology, but when we think about it, that starts giving an extra safety part as well. So there are some toxicities measured. We have to think through. Someone can say, and there was a paranoia at one stage because of the chemicals used around the world when they started realizing these can cause cancer and such like. So in South America, there was, they immediately pulled back on using the chlorination, and it resulted in 7,000 deaths because their source water was not at all secure. So we always have to balance up the risks, where we are and what's the specific location and what is the risk level at that location. Are we going on time? I have a whole lot of other things I may have talked on, but I don't think I will. The gut, thank you. That's another risk factor again, and that's another whole talk in itself. We now know that there's been a paradigm shift in our understanding of health going on at the moment. A truly paradigm shift. For 500 million years, and I'm sorry if I offend, because I did once, offend any people who have trouble with evolution. So, and she said it's all right if you say scientists say. Scientists say that we know the Earth started, scientists say the Earth started 4.8 billion years ago or so. 1 billion years later, bacteria came and evolved with it wherever they came from, either de novo or perhaps from space, who knows. And they were there for 2 billion years, 1 billion years, 1,000 million years without any oxygen. They're the ultimate survivors. And then there's a long story, but that's another one. And about 500 million years ago, the first of the starting to be larger cells, non-bacterial larger cells, started forming animals and species. So us or our predecessors for 500 million years have co-evolved with a gut flora, microbes. And there's 10 trillion of us, tissue, and 90 trillion, or 20 to 90 trillion microbes in each one of us. We now know when we're born, that beautiful little babe gets a mouthful of mother's perineal cum fecal flora when it's born. It comes down, and that's the heart of its new immune system. It's the heart of its immune system. And primarily since about 2007, we've just started learning that that gut flora is totally key to our whole function, including our immunology, our metabolism, our neurology function, totally integral. There's 500 to 2,000 species. So they're seeded early on, and those 500 to 2,000 species are in various ratios unbelievably complex, those ratios. And the initial seeding is really, really important. When babe is that first year is coming through, and we now know that chlorinated water, it actually makes a difference if the water is boiled and cooled before using it for these babes. I haven't seen anything in the papers saying ongoing advertising from MOH. I know we haven't been chlorinated before. Make sure you all boil your water before you feed babe, either when we start taking them off breastfeeding and or with formula milk, and because we know that changes the microbiome of babe. It changes the ratios, and that changes medium to long-term outcomes, health outcomes for that child. So there's a whole lot of things that are just not as clear-cut. Chlorine, the primary product, is safe, as far as we can tell. What comes out of the tap is not just chlorine, but it's 600 other compounds. Then there's a couple of other things, as I think of it. I'm a bit prone to being random. But, there are some countries that do not chlorinate, and Netherlands is one of them, and there are 5 of them, I think, in the EU. And what's their experience been? And with non-chlorinating, you have to make sure your system is very good. So the source, you either have to somehow secure that to make it good, and you can either use chlorine or UV light or filtration systems going through deep soil and such like, however they do it. And as you're implying, you need a really good underground reticulation system and pumping system. And they have had some minor, very small clusters of things as a result of that. It's probably acceptable risk. But the countries that chlorinate in the EU have had larger outbreaks. Have had larger outbreaks. Really, really important point, than those that don't. How can that be? Any of these systems, it takes this thinking process and understanding. So, yes.
I've got a rude idea. Amsterdam, I just think of oral sex.
Yep.
It might be helping.
Might be helping clear out the GI tract, you think? Yeah. One never knows. One never knows. That's an interesting take on
That's
it.
his last question.
An interesting take on it.
Our brochure, Health 2000, is all on the gut flora.
Yeah.
Slump. It's just a
I'm
promotion.
not sure. There are some Neisseria gonorrheas in 5 different continents now that are totally untreatable by any antibiotic. You might just bear that in mind when
Next time you're after that.
Shut up, David.
I'm one of 6 children. We had a breeding centre.
Stick to the tulips.
So that's not straightforward, but also you can imagine there's always financial pressures and always systems. So if you've got chlorine, you don't need to worry about the leaky pipe so much. And so they get rustier before you do the maintenance. And so there's more of the chlorine reacting with the ferrous oxide and such like, which gives more of these compounds, which are more trouble at the tap. So there's perverse types of things can happen. And ultimately, if you know, well, it's chlorinated so it's safe, so you don't mind if there are 100,000 cattle defecating all over the top of it. And so you just have to ignore the slightly turbulent look about your water when you're drinking, because at least, you see what I mean? It's not straightforward at all, I don't think. And in general, we're much, much better. We know modern, what we call modern progress. There's been many, many, many benefits to it, but there's been some major ecological downfalls with it, and that's compromised water systems and such like. But we happen in Christchurch not to be basically like 98% of the rest of the world. So why should we follow an algorithm And why can't we put a reasonable thinking process in? And it seems remarkable to me that I think the water assessors, they were disbanded because they had already ticked off, according to the paper anyway, they'd been ticked off. Some of the wells had been repaired and everything, and they knew the source water was fine, and so they were got rid of because the government had come out saying we might be heading down that line, but the MOH went one further and said we want to chlorinate all water in New Zealand. It is wrong. It is really, 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 really wrong. And the more I read on it, the worse it gets, actually. I just think there's a cost either way to chlorinating or not. But we like clean, good food. We don't irradiate food here because we prefer not to have tomatoes that we're just about to go off, but we irradiate it and you don't know that. And we don't want water like that that's just putrid, but it's sterile. And that's essentially what it comes down to. It is better, as we're lucky enough to have it, why will we destroy it? Why will we destroy it?
Craft beer. Wellington is the centre of craft beer, and the government, they want us to drink more craft fermented beer. Right.
Thank you, Ben. Now, and David, you've used up your questions. First question from an engineer. Water engineer.
Can I just expand on the whole evolution? Because one of the things I've often thought is basically we're a chemical processing unit. You know, we take in water, we take in sustenance and everything else. And we've evolved on this planet for millennia. And then all of a sudden in the last couple of 100 years, we've been bombarded by everything. We've got antibiotics, we've got everything that we eat now has been touched by plastics. We've got chemicals in the ground, we've got GM modified food, and all of a sudden there's been a huge paradigm shift in literally what's going through our mouths and going through our flora in our stomach. So the water obviously is crucial to life, but what's your thoughts on all the other things that is going through? The plastics, the air that we breathe, the food that we eat, the food that's been modified before we eat, and everything, the clothes that we wear, the shampoos that we put on our head, all bombarding our system.
It's a deep question, and
I'm an engineer.
part of it,
It's unusually deep for an engineer.
no comment.
Yeah, thanks, Gary.
Part of it is we have created I'm going to come at it a number of ways. We know that in general, in spite of all the plastics and everything else, and I'm a microbiologist, not a chemist, we are living longer. So we have to think, in spite of all that, we're living longer and generally healthier. However, there are a number of caveats there. We're getting a lot more chronic illnesses, and they're doubling every 10 to 12 years or so. You think of all the Crohn's, multiple sclerosis and everything else. And although it's another whole talk, our gut flora, which is actually, we've somewhat ignored it, it's a bit pooey stuff and ignored it, since 2007 when in the 1990s, there's about $2 billion looking at a human genome. And by, I think it was 2001, tens of thousands of scientists, they finally came up with the human genome of one person. And that was updated in 2004, I think, something like that, $2 billion. That can be done in half a day now for a few $100s on a person. That's how much the technology has changed. So following that, around 2007, the microbiome, our gut flora, started being looked at. Because we have about 23,000 genes, roughly, as humans, 20 to 23,000. But the gut flora of all those species, 500 to 2,000, cumulatively has 2 or 3 million genes. And the genes are responsible, they talk to each other, the bacteria talk to each other, and they also communicate with ourselves. But those microbes for 500 million years in our gut flora were our first line of protection. Just like a forest is the first line of protection from stopping Marcella tussock or other such things growing. That complex. Since 1943, we have lost half of our microbial species, half of our first line of protection, so we're more vulnerable. Which is why, because we're more vulnerable, we have to increase our hygiene even more, because people are more susceptible to bugs because we've made, and yet what we need is water with some bugs in it, and we need more fruit and vegetables, and we need more people actually living rurally and having dogs licking their face, and we know what they lick beforehand. We need to be exposed to so we get skid marks on our face. We need to be exposed to more microbes. We know eating dirt is good for us. We've yet to learn which types of dirt are the best types, but there is definitely, we know we've lost half our microbes from people that have had climbing accidents and dropped down crevasses and such like, and they pop out 10, 50, 100 years later, and their microbiome's looked at. We've lost half, so in general, we know, for instance, if we look at a debilitated 65-year-old, they have far fewer microbial species in their gut and fewer numbers of them within each of those species than does a fit and healthy 100-year-old. Yeah.
How do we get them back?
Get a dog.
Question? Oh, hang on.
Well, I have a comment or three on this. People like the Hadza, which live a reasonably traditional life in East Africa, have also been used as reference standard for species and species diversity and quantity.
That's right.
Fibre is another thing that's incredibly important. Insoluble, soluble fibre for nurturing, diverse ecosystem in our gut. But my understanding is that we kind of have a very resilient microbiome. We can lose it from birth, but it's very hard to increase the diversity once it's set in place at the time of birth.
Yes, I would. The first 3 years are critical to laying down the microbiome. Totally critical. So a babe born by vaginal delivery, as they have been for 500 million years, it's a mouthful of mother's perineal flora and or fecal flora, all the E. coli and everything else. That's the heart of its new immune system. The babe, which a third of us now do, that gets born by caesarean section, gets its base flora is different to...
And mostly from the nurses or the people...
That's right, the nurses and the hands. Yeah. So it's not fecal flora, hopefully, they've cleaned their hands a little more. And so from nurses and families, so it's more skin and such like, but it's different.
Yeah.
So they're more prone to obesity, eczema and dermatitis.
And other asthma and...
Yeah, there's a whole lot of other things. So that when babe is born and laid down, that first 3 years is critical, as is breast milk. Breast milk has lactose in it, and it has lipids, and it has complex oligosaccharides, which are a fancy word for complex sugars. Plus, teeming with bacteria. One particular type, bifidobacterium, which is the only one that can break down the complex sugars called oligosaccharides. It's the only one that can do that. And so it does that. And the breakdown of that, doesn't matter about the name, they produce all these compounds called short-chain fatty acids, which come back and they're responsible for all our metabolism. So I literally almost wept when a breast milk bank that I was associated with, and it was fresh milk with all these bugs in and all the rest, and the MOH said, it's got to be pasteurised. I cannot believe this. It's just, that's what the algorithm says. I just cannot. There's one thing that changes all the development of that child, you're wiping out. So all of these things, risk is often, more emphasis is placed on acute short-term risk than more significant medium to long-term risk. And that's where I have troubles, major troubles on that. On that milk run, while I'm on it, for instance, just to show you how important it is, because those complex oligosaccharides in the milk, as mother 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, she produces different forms of complex oligosaccharides. Alright? So, a study was done in Australia and Sydney where they took kangaroo joeys or whatever, took them, and they then, so newly born joey, and then they fed it with kangaroos that had delivered their joeys 1 month, 2 months and 3 months ago, and those that were fed the 3-month-old milk raced ahead their development to 3 months. Those to 2 months went through to 2 months, those 1 month came through. There's a direct correlation. So the next thing to do was, can they take human breast milk from humans that have given birth at term and feed that to very premature babes to try and accelerate them through? So why would you pasteurize it?
Not to mention formula, which is
and formula's the same.
lives and breathes by.
That's right. It's the same. All of that. I just truly, and there's a risk, of course. If the woman had a breast abscess with bugs in it, it's possible it could pass on. There's a risk. But I would maintain that anyone donating milk is really ethically driven, and like blood, people are ethically driven, and you fill out a questionnaire, and there's a lot of trust in that, filling out the questionnaire. There's a risk, but you might die if you don't have that blood, because that's the only time now you'll be given it. And similar with the babe, do you eliminate the short-term risk of them getting an infection at the risk of causing them medium to long-term significant adverse outcomes? Your fibre part of it, I agree totally. There's a major study done, I can't remember how many years ago now, where with this new technology they were looking at the fecal flora, and they invited 25,000 people, the first 25,000 from around the world, to donate their fecal sample for free, and they get it fully analysed. But they had to say what their medical condition was, and everything they had eaten, I can't remember, for the last 1 week or 2 weeks, every last thing detailed. So they got 25,000 people from around the world, and there's a direct correlation between increasing health benefits up to 25 different plant-based products a week. Didn't matter how little there were, it was the variety that counted. And so pepper was one. And for that I use the analogy, it's like NPK fertilizer. NPK covers most things, but if you have trace elements as well, often there's other plants that just need certain nutrients. So we've got the 500 to 2,000 species in our gut, and the more variety, didn't seem to matter about the meat, it was the plant-based products and the fiber's got these complexes that only the microbes in our colon can
And avoidance of refined
Hang on.
sugars.
Henry.
Was that the American Gut Project? Just to be.
It's so long since I've read it now, and I've got
Look up the American Gut Project.
I've got
everyone, if you
another-
want a good read.
another 2,000
Sure.
journals on the USB sticks.
Henry.
Thanks, Ruud. Thanks very much for the talk. I've already formed a position about fluoridation by reading about people like Professor Paul Connet. But when I hear that that is actually a very harmful thing, especially to the IQ of developing children, etc. But when I heard what your talk was going to be about, I just typed in chlorination bad into Google, and straight away hit 2 sites that said that it can be 93%. It may raise the risk of cancer in the bowel tract and other places by 93%. That there's villages where they went from spring-fed water to chlorination, and there have been no history of heart disease in that area. Instantly heart disease developed. That this has been tested on chickens, and that chickens fed chlorinated water also start developing circulatory and atherosclerosis and heart issues. And yet I've never heard a buzz about this in the media or from the bureaucrats since the whole chlorination issue came up. And I just feel like, well, we're not getting the whole deal. We've been treated as sheep. What's your feeling?
The sort of comment I would make on that is, I did, just in the last week since Gary set me up, did a whole lot of reading on chlorination, and from what seemed, all I can say is seemed credible. There's always a trouble with science, just because there's not a paper written on it, so lack of, I can't remember the phrase now, just because there's no science on it doesn't mean to say it doesn't happen, all right? But we also have to be really careful with science, because if you were to look up Google and look at vaccinations, good or bad, and it's a good one to you, you can find exactly what you want. Andrew Wakefield is still being quoted, and here's the one that proved the link between autism and mumps, measles, rubella, MMR vaccine, utterly proved it, it was published, all the rest of it, until it was found it was totally fraudulent, he struck off the register, everything else. That's still on the internet, and tying in, which is a little bit different to what you're saying, but just to show, tying in with that, people wondering why WHO says vaccine hesitancy is one of the biggest issues facing human health, as we see with measles at the moment. And there have been papers written on why does it happen, and it's actually understandable. In Europe, they've done a lot of papers. It tends to be relatively poor, arch right-wing people that are anti-vaccination because they distrust intellectuals and politicians. Why do they distrust them? Because they're still poor and impoverished in spite of everything that's been promised ongoing. So you can see how that comes about.
That's how Trump got in.
And Trump invited Andrew Wakefield to attend his inauguration. He's no fool, he's no fool. I'll get that slash of votes, knowing, and Andrew Wakefield will be able to go back, and he's no fool. He's no fool. Beware, he might be mad, but he's no fool.
I've got a question. Certainly the electric activity of chlorine ions are certainly affecting brass fittings. With one property I own where the brass fitting is isolated by it being in an alkathene pipe, and that brass fitting has failed. The tap that similarly was connected to that also failed, and the water heater also failed within that one property. I understand the mechanisms that might do that. But then I also turn the hose on my garden, right? And I'm wondering if the equivalency of the biome in my garden, which obviously looks after my soils and the plants that grow in it, what of the chlorine that we're putting on our gardens, and what's the long-term effect of that in terms of utility of those soils? Do we have any research on that?
Okay. Once again, this is a wide question. When we put chlorine on the garden, it will do its action, and then primarily the chlorine will be given off as a gas. So it will change the microbiome, because if it kills bugs in the water, it's going to kill them on the ground. So it will do that. But then it is given off as a gas. I would say I'm not aware, but I haven't looked, of any writings on what we're now, or since the 1970s, starting to learn about. It's not just the chlorine, it's the 600 other compounds. When it reacts with soil and such like, let alone rust in a pipe, 600 other compounds. And the complexity of trying to understand that or have science on that will be years away. So, but I would add that it's taken us 50 years to realize, I think realistically, whatever we put on the environment, there's an effect. Sometimes we don't learn about it for a long, long time, but there's always an effect. And there's a balance of risk. Sometimes we just have to use something to get rid of the stinging net or the rest. There's always a balance of risk, but there is an effect. We're just starting to learn, or well past just starting now to learn, it's exactly the same with our internal environment and our gut flora.
Bill,
And sorry, just to interrupt briefly, we know the soil around the world, there's soil banks, and the soil microbial composition around the world is totally different to what it used to be. The whole ecology of the soil has changed. There's a place between Finland and Russia, which, because it's always been a tension area, has never been developed. That's one of the few places that has original soil.
Wow.
It hasn't changed.
So now we've got the Professor of Soil Science from Lincoln.
Wonderful.
No, I'm not going to talk about soils. I'm going to give you one shot. The other issue that we have a lot of at the moment is nitrate, and I was wondering if you would like to comment on the link between nitrate and blue baby that we hear quite a bit about.
I'm utterly not a biochemist, but this is another risk thing. If it's nitrates and human health, then to the best of my knowledge, when I last looked it up, that blue baby that was reported by the MOH at the nitrate contamination, there's been one case of it, of the blue baby in the world. Dreadful for that babe, but one case in the world that I know of nitrate poisoning. So we don't stop flying because there's one plane accident. And I'm not saying there's not other issues with nitrate, I'm not a chemist, but we don't stop flying because one person died in an aircraft accident, or one person died in a car accident. There's relative risk and perceptions of risk. What is reasonable? What will we tolerate as a risk of gastroenteritis in Christchurch? Just to turn that around. 1, 2, 5 cases a year out of 500,000, but we don't know if it may be higher risks with the chlorine, with these other things. So there's relative risks and what is acceptable. There's risk in everything. Risk in everything.
Great. Ben, I'd like to congratulate you on a very informative talk as one biologist to another, and as one who spent 30 odd years working on what happens with fibre in the gut. I understand a good deal of what you had to say. The first comment I would make is that compared to the water coming out of our tap, our houses are absolutely filthy. But what they're filthy with is bugs that we're already adapted to. My mother used to be a public health nurse from about 1947 onwards, and in the 50s and 60s she talked about summer diarrhoea is something that just happened to everybody. And we now no longer think of summer diarrhoea as a concern, either when we go on our holidays or in the lead up to Christmas. The other thing I'd like to point out is that we have, in the form of a healthy stomach, a very good way of dealing with any bugs that we happen to ingest. So if there's a boil water notice out, the first thing people should stop doing is taking omeprazole or antacids. And the other thing is that our gut is lined by mucins. And the thing about mucins is that they have a lot of amino groups on the outside, depending on what the bugs in the hindgut demand. And that reacts with chlorine like nobody's business. So there is a case from that perspective of minimising the amount of chlorine we use in our water as well.
I agree with everything you've said. As it happens, it's the difference when chlorine was tested on rats and something, and rats are not humans, there was primarily no relative cancer risk. But when we take water out of the tap, which has reacted and caused these other compounds, then things change. So we have hydrochloric acid and chlorides produced there, and there seems, I'm not saying something's not going to be shown distinctly in future, but it seems the bigger potential risk is when that chlorine's reacted with other compounds, the byproducts from that. So the older the pipe, the more of these other chemicals.
We know that the smell is not chlorine itself, but chlorines, which are due to the biofilms that form in pipes, and those same biofilms what we have in our gut.
That's right. Yeah. What was something else that just brought to mind in there? Well, it's an anecdotal story, but you're quite right. There's relative risk. These bugs have different numbers. So Campylobacter, for instance, we have to ingest about 500 before the average person would succumb to Campylobacter infection. Less than 500, the average person, their immune system would get rid of it. Influenza, it's about 800. We have to breathe in about 800 influenza virus before the average person would succumb. Less than that, our immune system gets rid of it. Norovirus, your summer one, is about 10 to 20 virus. We ingest in. Measles is 3 to 5. All right, 3 to 5. That's why it's so unbelievably infectious. Norovirus 10 to 20 is the infectious dose, as it's called, for an average person. Now, so that's we know now that from studies in the EU, USA and Asia, about 7 per 100 people every year get norovirus. Far higher than you ever imagined. But if you get a dose of diarrhea or vomiting, you don't normally go to the GP straight away. You know, I don't want to fork out my $50 or $60. I'm going to get over this. But there's far more about than people realise of norovirus. That's the one comment. And the other comment I'd make, Campylobacter, and was this filming, is it? I won't say the name of the person. She's a relative. But some years ago, I'm sure she wouldn't mind. I was on this isolated bay on Banks Peninsula, and having dinner there, and she said, I got Campylobacter. How could that happen? I said, well, your water ultimately comes from a stream. There's a sheep and everything, it rains, it comes down, and that's where you get it from. And she said, but I don't drink water. And I said, yes you do, I saw yourself pour a gin and lime. Out of the tap. She said, oh well, I just have one a night. And my husband didn't get it. She was 50 at the time, 55 maybe at the time. She said, and my husband didn't get it, and he has exactly the same as me. And I said, but you're on antacids, aren't you? She said, how did you know? Which comes back to our first line of defence. If you're on antacid, it takes away the effect of some of that first line of defence. Rather than 500 Campylobacter, you may only need 100 to give the infection. And so we also have to be mindful. What I think should have happened, without doubt, in Christchurch, is honesty and integrity and a thought process with the coronation. Key points: honesty, integrity, and a thought process. So as soon as they found out that the wellheads were suboptimal, they should have said, whoa, this has just come to our attention. We've had 6 winters or 7 winters with flooding and everything else. There has been no risk at all over that time. We do regular ongoing monitoring. There's been none. If you're really immunocompromised or already concerned, you may wish to boil your water before drinking, just the drinking water. But we think it's a theoretical risk only. After 6 or 7 years, there have been no contaminations. Over the next year, we're just going to get them right. We're going to get the boarheads right, and even the boarheads were not identified as a risk in Napier, and we don't have all the sheep on top of them here. So they should have been honest and fronted up, said there is a risk, we think it is negligible, so theoretical only.
Last question, Pete.
Ben, it seems you've got a pretty good grasp on history, and I'm curious, in looking back at public health over the centuries, do you see a similar parallel situation to what's been happening with chlorination worldwide, or specifically in New Zealand? And how have other situations in this same similar kind of context played out?
I'm not sure if I understand the question, so I might get you to clarify, but for a start I'd say we make no doubt at all public health is the single most important thing that has happened in the industrialized world. So clean water and vaccinations have been really, really, really the major things that have saved millions and millions of lives. So vaccines, clean water. Public health, though, has gone on to and so its funding's reduced to get the water right, and as the population's increased on the earth, not many places have the luxury of deep subterranean water. So much of the 98% of the world, it is appropriate that they do chlorinate. There'll be many others that could get away with it, as in if they redid their system, so it wasn't chlorinated, as of five EU countries, but much of the world, the first step is to get the water clean at source first, or soon once you take it out of source. And the chlorine has a real role there. the risk of dying from an outbreak will be much, much higher than dying of the cancer. So we're talking of the different, almost comes back to the engineer's comment, that it's these relative risks we have to think of. All these plastics and such like, we can keep getting things better. On general, we are living longer, but I must say, about 2 months ago, I was talking to some clinical managers in a rest home.
Closer to the mic.
Closer to the mic? I thought it got turned off though, it's not working.
No, it's still.
Is it still working?
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, I couldn't hear it, I could hear it before. And she said, because I'd given a talk on something there, and she said, oh, I just can't believe how much, she'd only been here 6 months, and she was dark-skinned, and she said, I can't believe how much dementia there is here. Back at home, for people the same age, we have almost none. And I said, where did you come from? And she said, Papua New Guinea. And I said, it's the same lifespan. She said, people at the same age, we just have, dementia is rare, and I come here and it's everywhere. So I'm coming back to the engineer on that to say, we're living longer, generally better, but there's a huge amount of debilitation and adverse things too. But I'm not sure, is that quite what you wanted in your question or not? I'm coming back to the public health part of it, I'm sorry, on the history. Antibiotics now are the single...
Antibiotics.
Yeah, and me too.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Antibiotics now, we're losing them really, really rapidly because of resistance. And as they become resistant, that'll be the biggest change. Now that the public health, water and such like is right, that is going to really, really acute hospipals and elective and transplants. That's going to really change our whole health system as a result of that. So it's been initially public health's the key one, but we've got that pretty right now. Although some people think it's so right they don't need to vaccinate, but we come back to, because the bugs are exactly the same as they've always been. They're ruthless, they're fighting for their survival. But now when the antibiotic resistance comes, and it's coming really fast, utterly untreatable bugs now.
Right. Wasn't that amazing? Yes, Pam always said you were fun in the nurses' hostel. She said, this is the first time she's been to the Tuesday Club, so you're quite honoured. Yeah. But isn't it wonderful to hear science explained to us non-scientists in the language we understand? And I think that Ben will make sure that the council get to see more of you. So thank you so much for coming. And I'm so grateful Pam and I stopped in for that cup of coffee. And we'll see you again. I think there's probably a few more topics in here. So,
hung up to dry.
Yeah. So anyway, thanks everyone for attending, and we'll see you next time.
Yeah. The only thing I was going to wonder is, what would Dave's next question have been?
Our sperm count has dropped by 50%.
Pardon?
Our sperm count has dropped by 50%.
And it's been raised, but I haven't had time to read through it. Is there any correlation to chlorination? It's been raised, I haven't seen the evidence. Correlation is